is the Big Stories Podcast, where we tell the amazing and inspiring stories from across the Big 12 Conference.
I'm your host, Cleon Wall. We continue to review the Big 12 basketball season with different teams. In this episode, we're going to talk to a couple of guys about a couple of teams who didn't make the NCAA Tournament in Oklahoma State and West Virginia, but they did make a postseason tournament. That's coming up a bit later in the podcast. But first, let's get to our storylines.
The Big Stories, 5 biggest storylines. Number 1.
Arizona State and Cincinnati got their guys, and they're both going home. The Sun Devils hired St. Mary's head coach Randy Bennett to run their program. Bennett is not a young coach at the age of 63, but he is an Arizona native who is excited to take over the program. After watching his St. Mary's teams for several years, expect a tough and physical team down in Tempe. The Bearcats are hiring Utah State's Jared Calhoun. Calhoun is an Ohio native and graduated from Cincinnati in 2004. He also spent a year as a student assistant under Bob Huggins. He went 55-15 at USU. By the way, former Cincinnati coach Wes Miller landed the job at Charlotte. Going back to the Big 12, with those two hires, that means the conference coaching vacancies have all been filled, unless someone else leaves for a new job in the near future.
Number 2.
The top 3 teams keep dancing. Arizona, Iowa State, and Houston were the 3 teams from the Big 12 with the best chance of reaching the Final Four. Now they are the only remaining Big 12 teams left in the field. ESPN's Myron Medcalf re-ranked the Sweet 16 teams and put Arizona number 1, Houston number 4, and Iowa State number 6. The Big 10 and SEC may have more teams left in the field, but those 3, they're a powerhouse right there. Arizona looked solid in their win over a scrappy Utah State squad, but Iowa State and Houston looked downright dominant in their second-round victories. The Cougars beat in-state rival Texas A&M by 31. Iowa State ran away from Kentucky without Joshua Jefferson in their lineup. Hats off to the top 3 teams in the conference. The Cats, Cougs, and Clones played some of the best basketball at the right time. The 2 teams who probably thought they had a good chance of making it to the Final Four at the start of the season are bounced in weekend number 1, and injuries played a big part in why they struggled this season. Kansas's Darryn Peterson struggled to stay on the court at the beginning of the 2025-2026 season. And then there's the whole controversy of pulling himself out of games because he wasn't sure if he was healthy enough to continue playing. You could also say head coach Bill Self was injured this year, not coaching one game because of his health. Though Kansas had some big wins during the season, it felt just a bit funky, like things just weren't right. They did fight their way back into their second-round game against St. John's, tying it up only to lose it on a running bank shot by a guy who scored his only 2 points on that bank shot. Then there is BYU, who lost several players to season-ending injuries, some right before the season started and a few during the season, and none was bigger than Richie Saunders. He wasn't the most talented guy on the team, but one of the most experienced and was a good shooter. He also had a motor that wouldn't quit. The team struggled after he went down, looked better in the Big 12 tournament, and was favored against the Texas Longhorns in round 1, but the Longhorns were dynamite early in the game and also had 16 offensive rebounds. That led to plenty of second-chance points, and the Cougars' doom. BYU's loss means the Cougars remain the school with the most NCAA tournament appearances without one trip to the Final Four, a record I'm sure the Blue Cougs hope to erase this season.
Number 3.
The potential top 2 picks in next year's NBA draft played for the 2 teams we just talked about. Depending on which mock draft you read, A.J. Dybantsa or Darryn Peterson will be number 1 and the other will be number 2. Now, both of them are out of the NCAA tournament, which is a bit disappointing, but not at all completely unexpected like we just talked about. In their possible last games of their college careers, Dybantsa had the better game, but Kansas also won a game in the tourney. So if you compare their 2 first-round games, you might call it a draw if you just look at the stats. But if you don't, I would give the slight edge to Dybantsa, and not because I work at BYU. AJ was a scoring machine in that game and had to keep his team close. He scored almost half of BYU's points, putting up 35 and also grabbing 10 rebounds. Now, don't get me wrong. Peterson had a good first-round game, scoring 28 points against California Baptist. He didn't have the greatest of games against St. John's, but helped lead them to a comeback. I just wish we could see more of them in the tourney because they are both really talented players. Another guy who could go in the first round of the draft and who I wanted to see in the second weekend was Texas Tech's Christian Anderson. Alas, he's also gone after the Red Raiders lost to Alabama 90-65. He scored 18 points and dished out 5 assists against Akron in that first-round game, but only made 2 of 11 shots against Alabama. In Adam Finkelstein's latest mock draft from CBS Sports, the sophomore was picked to go 20th in this summer's NBA draft. I would think that if he's rated this high after the NBA Combine, I believe he stays in the draft. But you never know. There are other top picks from the Big 12 still playing in the tourney. Watch out for Kingston Flemings, Braden Burries, Koapi, and Chris Sinak.
Number 4.
Let's give it up to TCU and Coach Jamie Dixon. In 3 out of the last 5 seasons, the Horned Frogs have won their first-round tournament game, including last week's thrilling 66-64 victory over Ohio State. They just need to figure out how to win their second game. And we're not talking just about Dixon's Horned Frogs. Here's an interesting fact. TCU has actually never won 2 games in the NCAA Tournament. Back in 1968, only 23 teams participated in the tourney. TCU received a bye in the first round, won their Sweet 16 game over Kansas State, and then lost to Houston in the Elite Eight.
Number 5.
Let's also give it up to UCF and head coach Johnny Dawkins. The Knights lost to UCLA in round 1, but it was UCF's first game in the tourney since 2019 and only their 6th time in the Big Dance. Of course, they didn't become a Division I school until 1985. The Knights were a Division II powerhouse in the mid to late 1970s under Coach Torchy Clark. I love that nickname, Torchy. But he didn't get it because he was fiery. He's a redhead and someone called him Torchhead when he was a young boy. All right, it's now story time. But before we get to our interviews, when I was a much younger man and I would watch games on TV, sometimes the picture would go blank and a graphic would come up on the screen and the network would say, we're having technical difficulties. Well, we had some technical difficulties with the interviews we conducted for Big Stories this week, but not bad enough that we couldn't share them with the Big Stories family. That being said, we are talking about Oklahoma State and West Virginia today. Let's start off with the Cowboys from Stillwater. They had a losing record last season, made it all the way to the NIT quarterfinals. They had a winning record this season, but not in conference play. Still, they only made it to the NIT. They won Game 1 of their postseason tournament without a few of their key regular starters. Victorious Miller and Anthony Roy were suspended. Those 2 guys returned in Game 2, but were hammered by Wichita State at home 96-70. In between those 2 games, I asked Scott Wright of the Oklahoman how much progress the Pokes have made from Season 1 to Season 2 under Coach Steve Lutz.
Well, honestly, it was a little hard to tell because they went through such a major roster turnover. You know, when Lutz was hired initially, he was a little bit late in the cycle, and he was kind of playing catch up in the transfer portal. They only kept 3 players from the year before under Mike Boynton, and so he had to rebuild the entire roster. He ended up with a bunch of seniors. And so graduated a bunch of guys, a couple more guys go in the portal, and suddenly he's got a whole new team for year 2. Now, he did get a roster that more resembles the type of offensive scheme that he wants to run. They were able to do some things that he wanted to do there, but they lost a little bit on the defensive end from what they had the year before. So you saw some improvement on offense and in building the roster the way that Steve wants to have it. But then you did see a little bit of a dip in what they were doing defensively, which I think is something that will be an emphasis going into recruiting and transfer portal after this season ends.
That being said, how disappointed was this team that they were not able to do what they needed to do to make the NCAA tournament?
Yeah, it was really tough for these guys because, you know, they got off to a really good start in non-conference play. They didn't play a super tough schedule, but they were competitive. They were doing the things they wanted to do. They were playing well and winning games. And, you know, you hit that wall that is the Big 12 Conference, and you just got to see what you've got. And they just didn't quite have enough. They had some games that would have really helped. You know, they lost to TCU 3 times, and all of them were heartbreaking fashion. You know, they blew a lead late down down at TCU, went to overtime in Stillwater, and then had a really tough one in the Big 12 tournament for the third loss. So, you pick up a couple of those, and that's, some important wins in your NCAA resume. Probably not enough to get them in, but they had some other games along the way. They really struggled on the road, which you gotta go steal some games if you're going to get into the NCAA tournament out of the Big 12.
A couple of bright spots, at least from the scoring standpoint for this team, were Anthony Roy and Parsifala. Both of them transferred in for their senior year. Then again, neither played in their NIT game against Davidson. Fala was injured, and Roy is suspended, or was suspended for the game. If you put that aside, what sort of verve did they bring to the team this year?
Those two guys were hugely important in very different ways. Fala is kind of an old school big man, big broad shoulders and bangs around inside, and better offensive player than I think those of us who covered the team were anticipating. He was really kind of their most important offensive player for a lot of stretches during Big 12 play. Now Anthony Roy is just a pure shooter and can fire from anywhere, and hits hit a long three and gets everybody fired up. And they had very different roles on defense. Obviously, Fala was good for dealing with the bigs, and then also if guys get beat on the perimeter, he could be a good rim protector. Roy, defensively was that's where he really struggled, and he made some strides later in the year, and kind of got things going, but that was something he admitted it from the time he walked in. When we first talked to him back before the season, he had never been pushed the way that he had by Steve Lutz on the defensive end. So it was a learning experience for him on that side. Those two guys were hugely important, and obviously we knew that Fala was going to be out. He tore his ACL late in the regular season, but then Roy not playing in the first NIT game was a bit of a surprise, and honestly, you take those two guys out of the lineup, it's hard to envision Oklahoma State winning a game, but they absolutely gutted one out in that NIT opener without those two guys.
Yeah, fans got to see a lot of Cowboys who didn't get a lot of playing time this year, or guys who normally didn't get a lot of playing time. And as you said, they pulled off the victory against Davidson 84-80. Who were some of the guys on this team that maybe some fans saw that we could see next year in the Big 12 who could provide some push for them in the Big 12 next season?
One guy that became really important down the stretch and played really well last night was Ben Ahmed, freshman center, who had to really step in and play a lot more minutes late whenever Parsifala got hurt, and then they had some other injuries in the front court, and he stepped in and had to do a lot that he hadn't been asked to do earlier in the season. And then behind him was Mekhi Ragland, a freshman who had played even less than him and also got thrown into the fire over the last 2 or 3 weeks. And Ragland was a guy who showed up, and he is a really big guy. He was weighing probably over 300 pounds, and I don't know exactly how high his weight got before he showed up, but that was something that Steve Lutz and his staff went to work on quickly, and have slimmed him down some. And I think you'll see the next development of that going into next season, because Lutz wants to get up and down the floor, and that's a big part of what this team does. I think with those two freshman bigs, the minutes that they got in the latter stretch of the season and in this NIT are going to be really valuable for the two of them next year.
You've now covered Coach Lutz for a couple of seasons now. What sort of trajectory do you see for the Cowboys under his leadership?
Yeah, I think that he is a really good, really smart basketball coach. It's just a matter of him getting the foundation of his team really built, and I think he moved in that direction this year. That first year, like I talked about with the scrambling they had to do in the transfer portal, you didn't really get to see what he wanted his program to look like, and so this year he really began to do that. He's got a really strong high school recruiting class coming in, 3 4-star guys guys, Latrell Allman being the top of the list, but also a local kid that a lot of people are excited about, Jalen Montanati, who was his father played at Oklahoma State back in the Eddie Sutton days, and was a big time star back then and a fan favorite. So you got some guys that are going to really bring some excitement from a youth perspective. You're going to have to deal with the transfer portal and see what happens there after the NIT is over, and who's going, who's staying, who they can bring in. But I really think that Lutz has built the foundation of what he wants this program to be in terms of a team that can score quickly and also play some good defense, which, like I said, that's the thing where they've got to make the improvements in the portal. But you see where he's wanting to go, and I really do think that he has a good future ahead of him. Now, you're in the Big 12, and it's not easy to make big jumps up the Big 12 standings, from year to year. So it's going to be a gradual process, but I think he's heading in the right direction.
Scott, thank you very much for joining the Big Stories podcast. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Now on to the Mountaineers, and the audio glitches were a bit more pronounced in my conversation with Blue and Gold Nation sports anchor Ryan Decker. Ryan, West Virginia finished the regular season 7th in the Big 12 Conference. Things could have been so much different, though. The last 6 games of the regular season were anything but pleasant. The Mountaineers lost to the bottom 2 teams in the conference in Utah and Kansas State. They also lost a couple of games to TCU and Oklahoma. They did have a couple of wins against BYU and UCF. But did you think West Virginia was in a bit of trouble going into that Big 12 tournament, even though they didn't have to play on day one?
Yeah, this was definitely a team that had kind of lost some of its mojo here towards the end of the year. You mentioned some of those losses that ended up biting West Virginia in the butt. This was a team that going into, I think that the final 3 weeks of the regular season was in line for the 6, possibly even the 5 seed in the Big 12 tournament if enough things shook out West Virginia's way, but instead just some bad losses, not getting enough help. Actually, and they really did get a lot of help from around the league to still be able to get that bye in the first round of the Big 12 tournament. But this team was so thematic at times, where really from the start of the season to the end of the season, there were a couple things that you just saw game in and game out that really never got any better or just consistently were there for this team. So very slow starts. This team was offensively challenged at times, and if it wasn't a slow start, it was waiting for that long drought, that long scoring drought to ultimately bite West Virginia in the behind. So you saw that in the Big 12 tournament a little bit. The other thing that really this wasn't as much of a story with West Virginia, I think, because of the scoring issue specifically. But this team, I think if you look at it around the margins, really struggled to take care of the basketball at times this year. And of course, you saw that in the game against BYU there in the Big 12 tournament in Kansas City with 22 turnovers, 14 in the first half. But at times this year, really struggled to take care of the basketball. And I think ultimately in some of those games late in the year, that's what you saw kind of being a difference maker of just, when you need that basket, sometimes that possession was a turnover instead.
Every season, all of us come in and we look at certain teams. We're like, okay, this is my expectation for this team. And rarely do we live up to expectations. But when you talk about your preseason expectations for West Virginia compared to how they ended up, how do you think things went in your mind for West Virginia in Ross Hodge's first year as head coach?
So there were certain things that I think really lived up to expectations, right? With Ross Hodge coming in, you knew this team was going to be defensive first. It was going to be defensive minded, and certainly West Virginia lived up to that. Top 3 in power conference or high major conference teams in scoring defense this year. I mean, Ross Hodge's team certainly lived up to that expectation. And then you've got Honor Huff on the offensive end of the court. Hey, Honor Huff was brought here to do one thing and one thing only, and that was make threes. And he certainly did that. 109 this year, the second most in a single season in program history. He's now top 30 all time in NCAA men's basketball history and made threes in his career. He's up over 400 now. So from those two standpoints, yeah, lived up to expectations, maybe even exceeded expectations a little bit. But there were other areas where it was hard to predict, I think, really what this West Virginia team was going to do, because you have to remember this WVU men's basketball program now on its 4th head coach in 4 different years. Not a single returning point, which you feel like is really unique, but in today's college basketball, not as unique, and really even in the Big 12. It was one of 3 teams in the Big 12 that didn't return a single point from last year, with Baylor and I believe it was UCF being the other 2. So it was hard to true expectation of this team. Now, you knew some of the names coming in, like Trayson Eaglestaff was a guy who scored at a really high level, at a lower level of college basketball with North Dakota coming in. He didn't quite, I think, live up to what a lot of people outside the program thought he was going to do. He struggled at times to really score this year, found it a little bit through Big 12 play, but then ultimately just kind of cooled off towards the end of the season. Brennan Lorient, I think, was a nice surprise for some people. This is a kid who did not start prior to coming to West Virginia, even though he was with Ross Hodge last year. Brennan wasn't a starter last year. He was a sixth man coming off the bench for North Texas. Turns into a really nice player. And Ross said this recently, that if the 5-for-5 rule was built for anyone, it's Brennan Lorient, a guy who you wish could get one more year in this role to really see what he can make out of himself. So it's kind of a long-winded and maybe a rounded way of answering your question, but there were some areas where I think West Virginia really lived up to the preseason billing and some of our expectations. There were other areas where they definitely fell short. I think we were all hoping or expecting they'd be just at least a little bit more efficient on the offensive end at time. That this was a real just slow process to get the ball in the basket at times. But you'll have that especially in a Big 12 conference where, look, a lot of the top teams in this conference, they are built with defense first, or at least defensive mindsets and a defensive mentality. So certainly I think, by and large, I think year one under Ross Hodge is a success when you add in the elements that I talked about a little bit there and some of the other elements as well. I think it's a great building block to build off of, and now year two coming up after the crown. It'll be interesting to see what he's able to do. He's got a good recruiting class coming in.
You mentioned Huff, Lorient. You also mentioned Eaglestaff. They're 3 of the 5 seniors who led the team in scoring this year, and you just mentioned about the recruiting class coming in next year. What does this team look like next season?
So that's an interesting thing, or an interesting question, I think, going into the crown, that I think we're going to get to speak with Ross. I believe it's next week at some point. So I know someone is going to ask him, what's this roster going to look like for the college basketball crown? Is everyone going to be available? Is everyone going to be staying? There's a guy in Jackson Fields who came here from Troy with some big expectations, only played in a handful of games this year. He got injured before the start of the year, got injured in summer camp, had wrist surgery, and never was 100%. So it sounds like they're hoping for a medical red shirt for him to, you would think, come back here next year and be a pivotal part of this 2026-27 team. There's a couple of big recruits coming in that I know Ross Hodge is really high on. One in particular is one of the, a top 100, top 50, I think, depending on where you look and what service you like, recruit. But the other pieces that could come back from this team, I think, are really interesting. Amir Jenkins, DJ Thomas, 2 freshmen who played a good bit as freshmen this year. And DJ in particular, he reclassified. Wasn't even really supposed to be here at this point, reclassified to be part of this team. So you look at this team, I think it's an interesting roster of what Ross will have next year if everyone stays, but I think we all know that's not reality in today's college athletics, right? Not every part of the band is going to be back together again next year. So, but it does seem like Ross and his staff have a good recruiting foundation. It seems like they do recruit a lot of the right things, and if he recruits to a similar mentality to what he recruited with this year, which was bringing in veteran guys who had experience in winning at different programs and different levels along the way, I think that does get you at least a leg up going into year two. Because one thing I think about this West Virginia team, we all kind of who covered this team agreed on, no matter what happened this year, you really never saw quit in this team. There were other teams around the Big 12, other teams around the country. You could tell when times got tough, times got really tough. You never really saw that out of this group. This group really did do a good job of staying together. So I think that personality, that mentality is what Ross is going to try to recruit to. And if he can get those types of players maybe now that better fit his style at the P5, P4 level, then maybe you've really got something to talk about here coming up in year two for Ross Hodge. But certainly we'll see what happens with the crown. I think a lot of people are interested to see what West Virginia does, how it attacks from a roster standpoint, the crown.
Well, you mentioned about the crown, and we've talked about the future, but they are going to play the Stanford Cardinal on April 2nd in that opening game of the college basketball crown tournament. What are you kind of expecting in that game from this team? Because, again, we don't know who's coming back and everything like that, but you got to figure that the guys who are not going to be here next year, at least those seniors who are not going to be here next year, they're thinking, hey, let's go out with a bang. So kind of, what do you think Ross Hodge is going to cook up in that first game against Stanford?
Well, Stanford's a really interesting opponent. It's an opponent who didn't have the greatest season in ACC play. Certainly had some notable wins. You think they knocked off Louisville early in January. They knocked off North Carolina at one point, beat a couple other NCAA tournament teams as well. But the big storyline in West Virginia's first-round matchup of the Crown is that Stanford has an honorable mention All-American guy and freshman guard Ibuka Okori, who was the ACC's leading scorer, better than Cameron Boozer, better than all these other star freshmen and star players that the ACC has. So it will be really interesting to see what West Virginia is able to do defensively against Okori. Now, certainly going through the Big 12 this year with all the talented freshmen and talented players in the Big 12, it's not like this is going to be the first rodeo against a really good player, right? Certainly you guys in BYU have one, and AJ Dybantsa. You had multiple in Richie Saunders when he was healthy, and Robert Wright III as well. West Virginia, as you know, had mixed results against those guys at times. West Virginia did a pretty good job, at least for a half, against Darryn Peterson here in the win over Kansas. Didn't do a very good job in the matchup against Houston, against Kingston Flemings. Didn't do a great job against Braden Burries in Arizona. So it will be interesting to see what West Virginia has learned throughout this year, and if there's a good comparison to be made from a scout standpoint. I think if you're Ross Hodge, Phil Forte and company, of what West Virginia can do to keep Okori in check for this game. Now, looking at Stanford a little bit, they're at or near the bottom of the ACC. And assist to turnover ratio, effective shooting percentage defense, and rebounds per game. So it's some of those same things that West Virginia doesn't do a very good job of either, or also struggles in. But the one thing Stanford does do well is they turn teams over. And again, as we know, you guys know it from seeing that first round game there in Kansas City, West Virginia can turn the ball over. So if Stanford's able to turn WVU over and then turn those into points, it's a game that Stanford could easily win on a neutral floor. But if West Virginia is able to take better care of the basketball and control Okori from a defensive standpoint, not let him get going, especially you take him out of the game for a half, just say, like they were able to do against Dybantsa here in Morgantown, then I think West Virginia has a really good shot. And that after that, it's playing potentially a really good, a near blue blood program, depending on how you want to determine that, and possibly Creighton or a team in Rutgers on the other side of that bracket as well. And then on the other side, you've got a couple of Big 12 teams and some other programs that certainly they've had success in the past. So the Crown is interesting. I don't know how any of these teams keep their rosters together, quite frankly, for this extended amount of time after the end of your conference postseason. It's a miracle that these teams are able to do that. But hey, if these older guys that you mentioned for West Virginia, I'm sure they're looking at this as one final opportunity to, kind of stake their claim. A guy like Chance Moore can maybe only be helped in this tournament. As athletic as that guy is, if he has a couple of nice games, maybe that gets him a pro opportunity somewhere. Brennan Lorient, same thing. A nice athletic piece. If he has a couple of nice games, can he get a pro opportunity somewhere? Maybe not here in the U.S., but somewhere around the world. And I think certainly for these older guys, that's what they're hoping to get out of it. If you're a coach, you're hoping they can pop off, or maybe one of your younger guys that you're hoping to build around can do that as well.
Hey, Ryan, out of the 8 teams that are participating in the Crown, West Virginia has the highest rated defensive efficiency. We've talked about their defense. Can this team, you've watched them all season long, can this team actually win this tournament?
In essentially a 3-game series, which is what this Crown comes down to with only 8 teams, and a 3-game series on a neutral court where you've gone 3 weeks in between games, I would say anything can happen. It wouldn't surprise me if West Virginia could run the table, as they say, and win 3 games out there in Las Vegas. It also wouldn't surprise me if Stanford is able to exploit some of those weaknesses that we've talked about, and it's a first-round exit for West Virginia. So not to maybe sidestep the question there, but I don't know if I'll be surprised no matter what the outcome is in Las Vegas, just because of the nature of this and just because you kind of wonder how motivated, not just West Virginia, but all these teams are, all these players are. You wonder how motivated some of these guys are, where their heads may truly be after a couple of weeks away from playing competitive basketball. It's the regular season, just such a grind. You get out of that grind and you take a step back maybe for a little bit. It's spring break here in Morgantown right now. You just wonder kind of where everybody will be in their headspace.
A big thanks to Ryan Decker and Scott Wright for graciously joining the podcast. Coming up on Thursday's edition of the pod, we will have a special encore presentation from Season 1 of Big Stories. And because it's NCAA Tournament time, we focused on former West Virginia basketball star Hot Rod Hundley. This episode was produced by Garrett Glauser, and I'm your host, Cleon Wall. Big Stories is a production of BYU Radio.